Sound came to the movies. After a brief dalliance with sound on disc, sound on film became the standard. An optical soundtrack was printed onto the film to the left of the image, looking something like this, depending on the actual technology used. Now this meant that the image frame had to be narrower, like this. Now this was the first sound standard, movie tone, and it had a ratio of about 1.17 to 1. As you can see, this is nearly square, markedly, noticeably narrower than the old 1.33 to 1 standard, and it was not to everyone's taste. So, in 1932, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences set the frame for the camera at 22 millimeters by 16 millimeters, and the projector aperture plate size was set at 21 by 15.2 millimeters. Well, that's about 1.375 to 1. Now note that the projector aperture is just slightly smaller than the camera aperture. That's just in case of any errors so that you don't get any edges of the frame showing on the projection. Now this is how sound on film worked. Microphones created a changing electric current which was amplified and fed to a device that was like a film camera without the lens. This was in a separate sound booth on the movie set. The electric current fed an electromagnet which vibrated a shutter in front of a light beam focused on the film. This drawing from a 1931 patent application shows just how it worked. The film from the sound recorder is blank, apart from a narrow strip at the edge where the sound is recorded. The film from the camera and from the sound recorder are developed, and this gives a negative image. The two films are then sandwiched together and contact printed onto new film, giving a positive print with the soundtrack at the side. Of course, the cameraman had to ensure that space was left on the edge of the frame for the soundtrack. This had to be masked off in the camera. And it also had to be masked off in the viewfinder. Otherwise, the cameraman might not frame his images correctly. These cameras did not have through-the-lens viewfinders. The Academy aperture stayed basically unchanged up until 1952. There were some forays into widescreen. For example, Fox Studios shot a cowboy epic called The Big Trail, featuring an unknown actor called John Wayne. They used Mitchell Grandeur 70mm cameras. It was not a success financially. Cinemas didn't have the projection equipment to show it. The Depression was biting. Fox were in financial trouble. So what happened in 1952? Well, this happened. Television. It had the same aspect ratio as movies, approximately 4 to 3 or 1.33 to 1, but you could watch it from the comfort of your couch. Why would you go out to the cinema? Television was one of the many near-death experiences for the movie industry. More were to come in later years. The threat posed by television sparked a torrent of creativity. The first response was widescreen. 3D was another. It's been revisited many times. The problem was how to implement widescreen in a way that the existing theater projectors could show it, meaning keeping the 35mm format. Now, the simplest way to get a widescreen format from standard 35mm was simply to crop the image, usually to give a 1.85 ratio, as you see here, compared to the Academy format. 1.85 became an American standard. In Europe, 1.66 was preferred. Now, this could be wasteful of film. However, it was usually shot open gate and cropped in the projector, called soft matting, as opposed to using a mat in the camera to do the crop. Or, of course, it could be cropped in printing. The disadvantage of this method quickly became clear. Because the projected image was being generated from a fraction of the available film, it was grainy and soft. And the wider the crop, the greater the enlargement, the worse it got. Studios tried new technologies to improve the resolution and impact of widescreen. One of the first, Cinerama, was an enormously complex system, using 3 linked cameras, shooting together to film 6 perforations high, and shown on a huge curved screen with 3 synchronized projectors. Every part of the process was complicated, including the screen. It also pioneered sound on magnetic stripe, recorded on a separate film, making a total of 4 films, so it must have been a nightmare to edit. If you're interested, there is an excellent Wikipedia article. Link is in the description. Cinerama was not successful. It needed specialized theaters with very expensive equipment for showing, and the 3 projected images never really joined up invisibly. While a demo movie called This is Cinerama premiered in 1952, it remained something of a curiosity, like IMAX. It did morph, though, into the more practical Panavision 70 single-camera 70mm system later on. Now, much more successful was the use of anamorphic lenses. This was pioneered by 20th Century Fox in its Cinemascope process. Unlike Cinerama, Cinemascope, or Scope as it was called, did not need special equipment to show, apart from an adapter on the front of the projector. It could be shown on existing 35mm projectors with relatively inexpensive modifications. Now, anamorphic had been invented by Henry Chrétien way back during World War I for military use. It uses a special lens to squeeze a wide view horizontally into the 35mm frame. It leaves the vertical unchanged. Of course, this distorts the image, but on the projector, another special lens attachment reverses the squeeze, de-squeezing the standard frame into widescreen. Chrétien actually used it for photographing tanks. Now, Fox actually tracked down and bought Chrétien's original hypergonar lenses, as they were called, for testing, while engaging Bausch and Lomb to make modern versions. Shooting of The Robe started using the original hypergonars. The standard anamorphic has a 2-to-1 squeeze, and anamorphic widescreen, after some changes, was standardized at 2.39-to-1, although it's sometimes called 2.35 and sometimes 2.4. Anamorphic was also often called just Scope after Cinemascope. Cinemascope movies were shot using the full silent film format, the full width of the film, without leaving a space for the soundtrack. This was the practice for all Fox movies, apparently, anamorphic or not. In addition, Fox changed the size of the sprocket holes to obtain a fraction more width. They made the sprocket holes narrower. Now, these were nicknamed foxholes. Cinemascope had another innovation, stereophonic sound. Magnetic stripes were applied to the final print film outside the sprocket holes as well as in the traditional inner stripe to provide 3-channel sound. The first film to use the Cinemascope process, as mentioned before, was The Robe, which premiered in September 1953. How to Marry a Millionaire came next. There were other widescreen methods, generally less successful. Cinerama, already mentioned. VistaVision, 1954, which moved the film horizontally through the camera with an 8-perforation pull across. The frame was typically 18mm tall and about 38mm wide. White Christmas in 1954 was an early example of VistaVision, and this was in a 1.5-to-1 widescreen. Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo in 1958. Now, negatives shot in VistaVision Open Gate were printed down to a standard 35mm for projection in various widescreen formats. VistaVision was short-lived, though it's been used in modern times for some productions, for instance, The Brutalist in 2024. And then there was RKO's Superscope. This was designed by the Tuzinski brothers, and this was a process rather than a format. It was photographed open gate, silent film format. A widescreen version was extracted in processing. It was then blown up and squeezed horizontally, anamorphically, to fill a standard 35mm frame, and in theaters, of course, unsqueezed using standard anamorphic projection equipment. The first movie to use this process was Vera Cruz, United Artists, in December 1954. The process was used for only 9 films before RKO went out of business in 1957. A Superscope was originally designed with a 2:1 widescreen, but this turned out to be a mistake, and it was redesigned with a 2.35:1 ratio and renamed Superscope 235. With Superscope, a great deal of the frame is not used, those parts above and below the crop. In 1960, Techniscope was introduced. This was a 2-perforation flat system with a blow-up to a 4-perforation anamorphic print. It was used for cheap spaghetti westerns, among others. It's economical on camera film, doubles the amount of time that you can get out of a film cartridge. Now, the thing about Superscope is that it is actually exactly the same as Super 35, though it wasn't called Super 35 at the time. Over the years, from the beginnings of movies, the quality of film stock had been improving steadily. Anamorphic system lenses were slower than spherical lenses, and they couldn't use the latest fine-grained but very slow film stock. The advantage of shooting with anamorphic lenses faded somewhat. In addition, many directors refused to use the anamorphic lenses because of the optical shortcomings. David Fincher and Stanley Kubrick, for instance. Michael Bay, in The Rock, used extreme wide-angle lenses, like 17.5mm, and this is not possible with anamorphic. Anamorphic rigs are also heavy, not good for action. The cylindrical anamorphics developed and used by Fox had problems also with close-ups. Faces became fatter as the actor moved towards the camera. And this was known as the anamorphic mumps. Later, Gottschalk, if that's the way it's pronounced, it probably isn't, developed a device using prisms that could be put in front of a standard camera lens and provided an adjustable anamorphosis. It could also be linked to the focus wheel and avoid the mumps effect. It was actually based on an optometrist's anastigmatism testing device. Panavision adopted this into the prism-based anamorphic lens, but this was neither small nor cheap. In 1980, Superscope was revived for the movie Dance Craze. Cameraman Joe Dunton shot using the full silent film gate for shooting without reserving space for the optical soundtrack. Now, this required recentering the lens mount on the camera. He also shot on Steadicam, moving the camera through the performers, which was innovative at the time. Widescreen was extracted, and the film was printed out to both 35mm and 70mm. The latter with magnetic stripe, 6-track stereo sound. The film has been remastered in 4K from the sole remaining 70mm print. This was Joe Dunton's own print, I believe. It may have been about this time that the term Super 35 began to be used for the process of shooting silent film format, extracting a widescreen, enlarging to full height, and anamorphizing in post to create a standard anamorphic print for projection. And this was regardless of the widescreen ratio or the number of perforations per frame, still called Super 35. Now, this process seems to be similar to Cinemascope, but unlike Cinemascope, Super 35 is shot using spherical, not anamorphic lenses. So what we finish up with Super 35 is an anamorphic print without using anamorphic lenses. And this can be quite an advantage. Super 35 was first used in Hollywood for the movie Greystoke, That was in 1984. It became popular, though, in the 1990s. The movie Top Gun was one of the first major films to use Super 35, primarily because anamorphic lenses and cameras were too big and heavy to fit in the fighter cockpits, and possibly they were too heavy to survive the high Gs. Now, one writer has claimed that the film was shot mostly anamorphic, except for the cockpit shots. That was Phil Rhodes. But I found an article in the American Society of Cinematographers magazine by Paul Robley. Link is in the description. And according to this article, most of the film was shot on Super 35 flat and framed for both 2.35 and 1.66 extracts from the center of the frame, rather than the standard common top. That's common top is where your extract is lined up with the top of the frame instead of in the middle. From later releases of remasters of the film, it's clear that it must have been shot open gate and cropped for projection prints, because the full 4:3 is available. In later years, the open matte version was made available in DVD releases. And there is, in fact, a short video on YouTube comparing the widescreen and the open matte 4:3 versions. Link, as usual, is in the description. Now, James Cameron has made many films using Super 35, including Terminator 2, True Lies, and The Abyss. The attractions of the process are that spherical lenses can be used, and spherical lenses are much faster, that is, they need less light, they are sharper, and generally smaller and lighter than anamorphic lenses. And it's very easy to create a television version of the movie. It was around this time that television was moving to widescreen 16:9 format. So often 3 perforation Super 35 is used for movies that will be shown primarily on TV, as that has, as I say, a native 1.78 or 16:9 ratio, so reformatting is not required. 1.85 cinema releases can be shown directly on TV with only slight letterboxing. Well, so much for film. Now, what about digital? The first film to be shot 100% digital was probably Star Wars Episode II. I think there may have been a couple of lesser-known movies that were shot before that. Episode 2 was released in 2002, and shooting took place during 2001 onwards. It was shot on the Sony HDW F900, which is also called the Panavision HD 900F, as both Sony and Panavision had collaborated on the development of this camera. Sony had been persuaded by George Lucas to develop the camera with a 24 frames per second frame rate. Now, this camera is the first of Sony's Cine Alta line of cinema cameras. For Episode 3, the HTC F950 was used, a slightly more advanced camera. Both cameras had a native frame of 1.78 to 1, or 16:9, otherwise known as Full HD 1920 by 1080, which happens to be the same as 3 perforation Super 35. But the movie was actually cropped to 2.4 to 1, so some of the fairly meager frame was actually thrown away. This 2.4 to 1, of course, as you remember, is approximately the Cinemascope ratio, so that was what people expected to see in cinemas at the time. This camera was CCD based and had 3 sensors, one for each color. The sensors were described as being 2/3 inch size, but this is a very misleading measurement, as no actual measurement of the sensor actually corresponded to this size. This measurement is a holdover from video tubes, and refers to the diameter of the vacuum tube containing a sensor. So the 2/3 inch refers to the diameter of the video tube that the CCD sensor would have been in if it had been in a tube. But this measurement has the advantage of making sensors sound larger than they actually were, so it's a great marketing ploy. I remember the marketing hype around 1-inch sensors, which were actually about 1/2 inch or so on the long side. So the actual size of the sensors in the HDW F900 was 9.59 by 5.39 millimeters. That gives a ratio of 1.78 to 1, or 16:9, as you might expect. That is 0.377 by 0.212 inches, so quite a lot smaller than 2/3 of an inch. In 2008, Sony released the F35 camera with a Super 35mm sized sensor. That was their description. It was 23.6 by 13.3 millimeters in size, for a ratio, of course, as usual, 1.78 or 16:9. Again, this is very close to the size of the frame on 3-perforation Super 35, as you can see here. So it seems to have been established, by this time certainly, that Super 35 sensors were the same size as the film frame in 3-perforation Super 35 film. But in practice, the actual size and ratio varies slightly from camera maker to camera maker and model to model. For example, the Blackmagic S6K Pro has a sensor size of 23.1 by 12.99 millimeters, again 1.78 to 1, as you can see here. This is the same, as I've said many times now, as the 3-perforation standard 1.78 to 1, again, as you can see clearly in this diagram. And it equates to 16 to 9. The red Komodo, on the other hand, is 27.03 millimeters by 14.26 millimeters, and that comes out as 1.89 to 1, which is getting close to the widescreen standard of 1.85. That's the cinema widescreen standard, 1.85. The Canon C70 is 26.2 millimeters by 13.8 millimeters, and again that's 1.89 to 1. The Sony FX30 sensor is 23.4 by 15.6 millimeters, which is APS-C photography size. That's 1.5 to 1 or 3 to 2. Same ratio as 35mm photography film, but with a smaller diagonal. The camera can be used for photography as well as video. It's a hybrid camera, but its primary design use is for video. The sensor image is cropped to get to the Super 35mm size, 1.78 to 1. Theoretically, this camera could shoot open gate, but it doesn't, because it doesn't have the processing power, and Sony did want to make this camera a lot cheaper than their larger cameras, so it doesn't have the capability. Interestingly, in Sony's current camera, the Burano, that's their big super-duper cinema camera, it has a huge sensor which is capable of being cropped to just about any standard film format or video format. But you can't use the full frame or anamorphic settings on that camera unless you pay for an extra license. It really is preposterous. But Sony have used that model for quite a while. I mean, back in the days of the F5, I think. The original F5 couldn't shoot 4K. Then you could get an add-on to it that could, and you had to get a license for that to be used. It's a bit like cars today. In the more expensive ones, the manufacturers are requiring that customers buy a monthly subscription to use some of the features on the car. Sometimes the greed of corporations just astounds me. I'm sure they can make enough money without doing stuff like that. Anyway, back to it. Now, lenses that were developed for 35mm film cameras could still be used for digital Super 35 because they would cover the same area. Now, this provides motivation for using and staying with the digital Super 35 format rather than moving to larger sensors, which would not be covered by these lenses, and then you'd have to get more expensive, bigger lenses. There is a move today towards using larger sensors in video cameras based on the digital still photography full frame size. And as I say, this requires larger and more expensive lenses, so it's not something that anybody or that everybody wants to do. OpenGate is a marketing ploy which is used to encourage selling these cameras. For digital, OpenGate simply means using the whole sensor rather than cropping to get one of the standard video widescreen sizes. Well, it's good for camera companies trying to sell into a pretty saturated market, but it's doubtful if anybody really needs bigger sensors than the Super 35. When I think that George Lucas shot Star Wars Episode 2 on a HD camera, recording to tape, with only about 7 stops of dynamic range, and then cropping that at 2.4 to 1, I think that certainly I personally can manage pretty well with a Super 35 camera shooting to 4K, or even to 6K, with maybe 14 stops of dynamic range. And consider also that the camera that Lucas was using listed at something around $44,000, I think, which is easily 10 times the cost of a modern Super 35 camera with much, 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 much better capability. Makes you think just how far things have come in the last 25 years. Well, that's it for this video. Please like and subscribe. And until next time, Slan. That's Gaelic for goodbye, or perhaps I should say Slan Gafoil, which is goodbye for now. Well, Slan Gafoil. All right. Yeah.